All right, let's talk about it. Blade didn't walk so that the MCU could run. Blade walked into a club, turned on the lights, and reminded Hollywood of two truths. One, that monsters can still be scary. And two, in 1998, superhero movies could still have an impact. And at the time, neither one was guaranteed. By the 90s, a lot of monster cinema had drifted into one of two lanes. Either monsters were being treated like camp or they were being treated like romance. Now, if you weren't alive at the time, the culture was in a weird spot in the late 90s. Even from the early 90s to the mid 90s to the late 90s, the entire vibe was different from section to section. And we weren't in a period yet where there was widespread reappraisal of these different movies. People weren't giving their opinions at scale yet. You had small pop-up websites, you had fan forums, different things like that. But this idea of monologuing about these older movies, that wasn't a concept yet. And so these characters were largely at in the hands of executives. And so these monsters were being presented with less and less edge in either direction. In the camp realm, you're looking at mascots, you're looking at cartoon characters or characters on a kid's TV show. With romance, you're looking at tragedy with cheekbones, you're looking at Buffy, you're looking at these different cultural subgroups that were taking the idea of vampirism or taking the idea of monsters and turning it into a fetish, turning it into an object of romance. Why do you think Stephanie Meyer, just not that long after this period, would start pumping out romance novels centering around a vampire and a werewolf? And then Blade walks in and pulls a move that really hadn't been pulled since Universal or Hammer was in control of the monsters. He shows up and goes, no, no, they're predators, they're organized, they're everywhere, and you are the food. Now, that goes beyond plot. That is a tone decision. And Blade's tone is the reason that it hits like a lightning strike. Not because it's the first of its kind or the most complex story in the world, because neither one is true. At this point, possibly the most famous vampire IP is in full swing. Buffy is running, Angel is a thing, but again, even in that world, the quote unquote demons, because everything's a demon in that world, they're really only significant toward the season finale. The focus is on the characters that are involved. And when they aren't being treated as a flavor of the week villain, they're the object of affection. It kind of perpetuates that whole subculture thing of vampire, of monster as this object of infatuation. The thing that Blade does differently is that it commits to the bit. It doesn't blink and it doesn't apologize. At no point does Blade lean back from its own premise. It looks you dead in the face and says, all of it, it's real. And if you weren't around at the time, then you may miss the fact that the cultural timing part is vital when talking about Blade. Because in the late 90s, horror was changing. Slashers were either burning out or becoming self aware. And monster movies are getting shiny and silly, and superhero IP at that point had drifted fully back into camp. We were not riding high like we were in the early 90s. And even when horror is good, there is a creeping sense in the 90s that audiences are in on the joke. At this point, monsters are brands. They're mascots, they're merch, they're references to a bygone era. And look, I love a good comedy horror, and I love a good monster with personality. There are a lot of really great examples of the monsters where their unique personality or their unique motivations are on full display, and it's great. But there is a cultural cost when monsters stop feeling like monsters. When the vampire stops feeling like a predator and starts feeling like a character that you're supposed to like or you're supposed to find attractive. When the creature stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a punchline or an action hero. And then Blade comes out at the perfect moment, right when that monster as entertainment drift is in full swing. And it reasserts something primal. The monster is supposed to feel like it could turn on you at any point. And it doesn't reassert any of this with long speeches about the gravity of the situation. It reasserts it with craft, with an atmosphere that is undeniable and confidence that drips from the screen. At this point, monster movies centered on adults are basically unheard of. And it's important that this movie not only commits to its tone and its atmosphere, but it's a Marvel IP that doesn't lead with capes and cowls because that's not where Blade lives. And it does a bold and it makes a bold move because it wears its heart, it wears its thesis on its sleeve right from the opening scene. Everybody that has seen Blade remembers the Blood Rain nightclub scene. And they remember it because it's basically the movie's thesis written in pure sensory language. We're not easing you into this world, and we're not politely world building. We are not asking your permission. We are throwing you into a space where humans are partying without realizing that they are in a feeding ground. Then the sprinklers go off, and it's blood. And in one move, the film establishes that vampires are not folklore, they are part of the infrastructure. This world is not safe, it's already been compromised. And you're not watching a standard superhero movie. You're watching a horror ecosystem dressed in neo noir, where the hero is a response to the infestation. And then Blade shows up, and the camera does not frame him like, here comes the savior. It frames him like something worse just entered the room. A bigger predator is now here, and that is key. Blade is heroic, but he's presented like a horror figure turned in the right direction, a predator that hunts predators. That's such a specific flavor of cool, and it's the flavor that the culture was ready to inhale in 98. This is where the movie gets smarter than people remember because Blade's biggest flex is that it treats vampires like a society and not like a gimmick. Blade doesn't treat vampires like random creatures that pop out for jump scares. It treats them like a hidden upper class. They have hierarchy, they have rules, they have fashion, and they have politics. They have laboratories, they have blood banks, nightclubs. They have a whole world layered underneath ours. So the horror isn't just, hey, vampires exist. The horror is vampires have been winning for a while now. They're not hiding in caves. They're thriving in the cities. They learn how to blend into modern life. That is very late 90s paranoia coded. The fear that the system is run by something predatory that looks normal up close. It's almost like we had it figured out back in the late 90s, but that's a whole other conversation. The movie plays all of it straight. There's no cartoon vampire laughs, no goofy fangs, no isn't this silly energy. It's adult, it's clinical, and it's predatory, which is exactly what superhero movies needed at that time. A way to feel grown without feeling embarrassed to be what they are. And that's what makes Blade feel different from a lot of superheroes that came before. He's not introduced like an icon. He's introduced like a working professional in a war that the public doesn't know is happening. He's not doing a discovering myself arc. There's no pearls and there's no popcorn. He's already deep in the job. He has routines, he has scars, he has tools. He has a mentor who feels like a guy you'd actually want next to you in a dirty fight, not a friendly wizard. And Snipes plays Blade with this tight, controlled intensity that never drifts into parody. Blade doesn't perform heroism for the audience, and he doesn't ask to be liked. He doesn't explain himself. He just shows up, he does the work, and he leaves. That's why the movie's cool lands. It's not trying to be anything. It's moving like something that already is. And again, it's the perfect cultural moment for all of that. Late 90s audiences were primed for anti-heroes who feel dangerous, competent, and emotionally closed off because the world around them is ugly. Blade fits that. And the horror tone is the delivery system that Marvel needed at the time that they needed it, because Marvel was in a bad way at this point in history. And even though the 90s kind of became this homogenous glob of neon or grunge or Nirvana or very specific look and feel and aesthetic, the truth is there were huge shifts throughout the decade. And the cultural feeling was a lot closer to Blade than history sometimes really gives credit for. And that's the part that connects directly to this is where Marvel started learning. Blade is Marvel realizing something that becomes the secret sauce later. You don't sell the character. You sell the genre experience that the character fits inside. Blade is action horror through and through. So the pitch to the audience isn't come watch a Marvel character. The pitch is come watch a violent vampire war with insane style and a lead who feels like a walking weapon. That's Marvel learning how to package itself. Marvel will eventually turn this into an art form. Spy thriller, heist movie, space opera, horror, teen comedy. But Blade is one of the earliest, clearest proofs that this works. Because if you walked into Blade in 1998 with zero Marvel knowledge, nothing felt inaccessible. Vampires, you're in. A hunter, you're in. Secret world under the city, you're in. That is accessibility through genre to a T. And it's the beginning of the modern Marvel playbook. Monsters had become safe, and so Blade made them unsafe again. And all of this is particularly notable because monsters were not dead. They were not gone. They were just familiar. And so Blade reintroduces danger. He reintroduces bite. He reintroduces the idea that the monster isn't charming, it is a part of the structure of the human experience. That the monster is not just a creature, it is a part of an ecosystem. And then it gives you a hero that isn't a Boy Scout who operates in shades of gray. It gives you a hero that matches that ecosystem. Blade doesn't fight crime. Blade purges an infestation. That framing is horror framing to a T, and it changes the temperature of the room. And for every good hero, you need a good antagonist. And that's where you get Deacon Frost, the perfect villain for this cultural moment. Frost feels modern. He's ambitious. He's younger. He wants to disrupt the old vampire aristocracy. He treats tradition like a weakness. He wants power now. So you get this tension between old world monster politics and new world monster ambition. It's basically the monster is evolving with modernity. And Blade, again, sits right in the middle. A hybrid who doesn't belong anywhere, not truly, hunting a system that adapts faster than morality does. That isn't a deep philosophical treatise. It's a solid engine for a genre story. And that hybrid approach to Blade and really doubling down on his comic origins is exactly what gives the film drive beyond Kill the Next Vampire. Blade is one of the first times that a Marvel movie feels like it has a world happening beyond what's just in front of the camera. That it's not just a setting, it is a whole world. It feels like if the camera stopped rolling, the vampire society would just keep functioning. And that's huge because superhero cinema becomes franchise cinema once the world feels bigger than the plot. And Blade has that. It's not just here's a hero and here's a bad guy. It's here's an underground reality with rules and hierarchy and history. Again, commitment, presentation. You can feel the filmmakers building a space that they believe in. And that is where Marvel really dug into this idea of making the tone the brand. Even though this wasn't Marvel Studios the way that we think about it later, Blade becomes a proof point for Marvel as a cinematic property. Marvel can work in live action if you pick the right lane, commit to that lane, and make the character feel like they belong in that lane. Marvel didn't start by being family friendly and quippy and brightly branded. Marvel started by proving that it could be stylish and adult and serious without being pretentious. Blade is a statement. This material can be cinema, not just an adaptation. Blade is culturally perfect because it gives the audience a new kind of superhero cool. And this is where you feel the shift. Because Blade isn't Superman heroism, it's nightclub mythology. Blade is martial arts brutality. Every single fight matters, every single punch has impact. Blade is gothic sci fi tech noir. And the late 90s absolutely wanted as much of that as it could get. Blade comes out right when the culture is leaning into industrial aesthetics, trench coats, underground scenes, action heroes who feel like they've been through hell and back, monsters as metaphors for hidden systems. Blade doesn't just match that moment, it belongs to it. And because it belongs, it doesn't need to convince you. It just takes you along for the ride. So when you say Blade is the birth of the modern superhero movie, this is what you mean. You mean Blade is the first time that the Marvel vibe on screen feels like it has a future. Not because it's the first Marvel movie a la Iron Man, but because it shows the route. We weren't at bright and shiny superhero movie era MCU, but we were taking stories that were in comic books that at the time were on very shaky ground and historically have been geared towards a younger audience, except for the time when they weren't. When everything was sci fi, when everything was horror, when you were getting the old EC comics back when Blade was thriving. And it shows that those stories are good enough to shape into an actual cinematic event. It never once asks the audience to love comics. I saw Blade in theaters before I knew that Blade was a comic book character. It gives them a genre that they already speak. That's one of the smartest moves that Blade makes. Superhero cinema, very little cultural cachet at this point, very little stock to be put in any kind of superhero or comic book IP. That's for nerds. And back then, it was not cool to be a nerd yet. But horror was thriving. Remember, we are in a post Scream world. So everything is teen slashers. Everything is Scream coded and trying to ride that moment in history. Creature features were kind of passe at this point. And so it disrupts the flow of horror while still utilizing the cultural cachet of the horror genre. Action movies were also big at that point in time. And so it's utilizing the shoulders of giants to bring comics to the mainstream. And it presents it with total commitment. It makes the world feel real and it makes the hero feel like a presence and not a costume. That is exactly how Marvel becomes the dominant film language later on. It starts here, in the dark, with vampires, with blood raining from the ceiling, with a hero who feels like a monster turned in the right direction. Blade isn't the beginning because it's early on. It is certainly not the first. Blade is the beginning because it's confident. It's Marvel learning how to walk into a room and not flinch. And once that happens, the genre stops being a novelty and starts becoming the thing that it is now. From here, we would go on to X-Men and then Spider-Man that was full, unapologetic. Even Daredevil and that era of comic book storytelling has its high points. I'm not saying it's all perfect, but this is where the road to the MCU begins. Because as long as the presentation commits, then you've got a platform where you can tell stories in any genre. Blade committed. And that's why it still feels like a turning point.